Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. I'm joined today by the man, the myth, the legend, my one-time partner in arms and podcasting, John Wood Jr. I wanted to get you on the line, John, so that we could have a frank, passionate, candid, compassionate conversation about the midterm elections and to model a value that we seek to cultivate at Braver Angels, and that is intellectual humility. What is intellectual humility? I like to think of it as the extent to which you're willing to recognize that you might not be right. Humility is something that is in short supply today, and we believe that it's key to the work we do. It's key to embracing nuance, and it makes it easier to empathize when you're willing to admit that you don't necessarily have all the answers. So, John, before we jump into the conversation, I'd just be curious to hear, what does humility mean to you? What is your relationship with the concept of humility?
Yeah, I think it starts with understanding the fact that almost invariably, when we talk about big, complicated subjects that evolve over time, that there's always going to be quite a bit more that you don't know than you do, really. And that's not to say that you can't sort of attain a command or a mastery of any number of things, relatively speaking. But human beings are limited. We're limited in our ability to know, to remember, right? To understand sort of the just how just how deeply complicated context can be, and therefore it's important for us to be able to give voice to our opinions, our convictions, the way we see things. But it's vitally important for us to leave, a fair amount of open space in our minds to take in new perspectives. And if you have such a sense of yourself and your own sort of self-righteousness, or your own sort of, high opinion of your opinions, to sort of delegitimize the perspectives of other people simply because they differ from you, or because they're coming from one place or another on the political spectrum or what have you. You close yourself off to new information, and you also sever this sort of connection of relationship that might allow you to learn something new and to be able to work with somebody collaboratively. Humility allows you to maintain relationships. It allows you to work with people, and it allows you to do new things, to learn new things. And so, being conscious of my own intellectual and even sort of, ethical limitations, that for me is at least one angle to take on the subject of humility and just what it is.
That's well said. And I think it's important to note that humility is not particularly fashionable these days. The incentives and pressures from
Not really.
profit to power to eyeballs don't necessarily incentivize humility. And oftentimes people think that being humble is a form of weakness because they'll be taken advantage by the other side. And that can be true, but humility can also be a powerful tool in conversation and even persuasion. And at Braver Angels, we love to get into the fray. And so we wanted to talk directly about the midterms today. I'm a progressive. I lean blue. John, I know you lean red. Today, we'll be talking from our own perspectives, but we'll also be seeking to think about the wider range of perspectives within our respective camps. And of course, with Braver Angels, this is also a public conversation, and we will be inviting our listeners to join the conversation on October 20th, when we will be having a national online debate on the midterm elections. So I encourage folks to think about what they might want to say. You can always send us your feedback to this podcast and then come prepared to make your voice heard on the 20th. So before we jump into some of the issues dividing Americans on both the policy and the culture side of the equation, let's be transparent about where we're coming from in this conversation and our own history and identity as partisans. John, I know that you one day volunteered for the Obama campaign and you one day ran for Congress as a Republican. You now work as a national ambassador for Braver Angels. Can you talk a little bit about that development and how you think about yourself in terms of partisanship?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I definitely grew up with different perspectives in my family, in my family politically, but thinking of myself as politically liberal and as really sort of an activist as I got into high school and shortly thereafter. Worked for Obama's campaign, as you said, in 2008, was very inspired by his sort of transcendent post-partisan, post-racial kind of message, but ultimately found myself becoming more sort of politically and philosophically and really culturally conservative as I tried to sort of deepen my understanding of conservatism for the purposes of bringing basically Republicans into sort of what I considered to be this Obama movement. Now, the desire to bridge that divide is something that I never lost, but I think that I came to a number of perspectives, and it had to do with changes taking place in my personal life at the time. Two, I had gone from being single to being married. I had experienced something of a religious conversion. We moved from, Los Angeles, which is, obviously a very left-leaning city, to Colorado Springs, which is a military town. We joined a faith-based community. And so suddenly all of my friends who I saw day to day were religious people and soldiers. Got to know the institutions of the church, of the military. And also, and this was very important for me too, began studying African American history from a more conservative vantage point, something that I had not done prior to that. And I just sort of looked up one day and went down a list of about 100 issues or so, and to my shock and horror, saw that I was like right of center on I don't know, maybe 62 or 65 of them or so, something in that area. And I came away from that just thinking like, holy cow, like I'm like kind of a Republican, and was not comfortable initially with that realization because, my self-identity as a liberal Democrat had been, fairly central to how I saw myself, and yet I had experienced these intellectual changes. But again, I still wanted to be a voice for bridging the divide. And so, my desire to run for office was really a desire to give voice to, sort of my own kind of approach to what I felt to be kind of, a message along the lines of what Obama's message had been, especially as a candidate in 2008 and before that, which was that as Americans, we've got a deeper identity and a deeper sort of soil of shared interests that binds us, as a people, notwithstanding our deep disagreements on policy, right? And so I talked a lot about policy, and I was definitely coming from a more conservative policy vantage point than Barack Obama would have been. But that message held constant, right? But on the level of policy, though, I talked quite a bit about seeking to use the government programs as sort of a necessary social safety net backstop for people who need sort of essential services, whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about Social Security, but to use the power of the marketplace through things like health savings accounts and private accounts that can be used to bring down the cost of Social Security and so forth, as market-driven means of securing people's financial freedoms. I'm somebody who really emphasized the importance of the church and of our civic institutions and of faith in general as something that brings together and anchors communities. And I was somebody who's, having also lived, in the inner city very skeptical about at least somebody who's very sensitive to the limits, I guess, of this sort of social welfare kind of system in terms of being a door opener to opportunity, particularly for, inner city African Americans and Latinos and people who are kind of locked in that environment. So, coming from a much more conservative vantage point, those are some of the points of policy emphasis that I, kind of drilled down on from this still kind of aspiration towards hope and change and crossing the divide. So, that's a little bit of how it played out for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it's interesting that your ideological evolution in some ways sprung from your own personal development as a man and a husband and a father. I think it's safe to say that today's Republican Party is a far cry from the party of George W. Bush or the party of Mitt Romney. You take someone like Liz Cheney, who one day might have been considered the consummate conservative. She has a very conservative voting record. Today, of course, she's despised by large swaths of Republicans. Just as a quick follow-up, how do you think about the difference here between, conservatism as an ideology and a philosophy to which you're attracted and with which you identify, and the party politics of republicanism, which are not necessarily the same thing?
I think that many liberals and conservatives today feel that the politics of the parties that they're traditionally used to voting for have sort of diverged from their understandings of sort of the philosophies, to the extent to which you have, Americans who are motivated by philosophical understanding of liberalism or conservatism. I think that a lot of us on each side of the aisle feel like there's distance between those two things. There's a deep conversation to be had about sort of what conservatism is as a philosophy. I do think that you're right. I mean, philosophically speaking, conservatism is about much more than, lowering taxes or, even national security or immigration policy. It's not something that can be reduced to mere policy points. Conservatism is in its sort of philosophical roots. If you're to read a book like The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, for instance, it's something that is anchored in a sense that societies develop the way they do over time according to the flawed and imperfect, but best attempts of human beings to build on the progress of their ancestors, basically, one generation to the next, to establish institutions that help create space for individuals and families to have positions in societies that can leverage their best sort of assets in a collective effort to provide for the general welfare in ways that, are not and likely never will be perfectly fair, perfectly just, perfectly sort of, equitable. And yet, if you sort of radically seek to sort of transform those systems and institutions without being mindful of how hard won the gains were to get there, you risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so, conservatism philosophically is deeply rooted in humility. And that's not to say that, liberalism, progressivism is not, but just to talk about conservatism, it's deeply rooted in humility, because it's meant to be very self-conscious of the limits of, sort of human capacity to just sort of intellectually leap to the right answer on all things, and to sort of know step by step how you actually get there. So it's not as if conservatism wants to freeze everything in place, but it's about sort of being wise enough to sort of, pursue change and reform at a pace and in ways that allow you to improve things without undermining, those things that actually have to be preserved. And part of, I guess, my criticism of conservatism in the moment is that I think we've forgotten the fact that that act of reform and that act of, sort of preserving the integrity and the role of our institutions, whether you're talking about civic institutions, whether you're talking about the church, whether you're talking about, local communities or universities or what have you, um, is rooted in our ability to sort of maintain relationships of trust with each other, and is rooted in sort of, the relationships we have outside of politics and government, even more than it is, the way we treat each other in politics and in government. But when you think that electing a president, electing a party that can, then pass legislation or appoint or confirm certain judges to the Supreme Court, when you think that politics is the way towards preserving sort of the levers of power that can allow you to sort of maintain the things that are good in America, while at the same time stoking, playing a power game in the rest of the country that divides the people against each other, you sort of do the same thing that you accuse the other side of doing. I think the idea being that, yeah, one side wants to, grow the scope of government, the other side wants to rein it in, but both sides are looking at politics as kind of like the answer to all the problems, right? If we could just attain power, then we could fix everything. And that leaps over the fact that actually what we need to be doing is building out our relationships of trust with each other and making the cultural arguments in ways that, maybe passionate and robust, need to be, but that don't sort of blow up our ability to kind of like reason together. I mean, conservatism is certainly something that needs to be passionately defended, but there's a lot that we leap over in the effort to just sort of win the political battle at the expense of the communitarian bonds of the American people. And so I guess that's kind of how I relate to that discrepancy a little bit in admittedly high philosophical terms, Mr. O'Connor.
I'm shocked to hear you use such terms. Just shocked.
Right.
Well, for my part, just so listeners can know where I'm coming from, I grew up in a bit of a liberal bubble, Manhattan, New York. Both my parents were journalists and on the left, although their politics are somewhat scrambled, as many of ours are. I was someone who valued diversity, but did not experience a lot of political diversity in my upbringing when it came to the populations to which I was exposed. I went to Duke University, which, while not potentially as liberal as schools in the Northeast, still leans left. And I went into politics working on the Obama campaign in 2012. I was always drawn to Obama, I think, John, for similar reasons as you, a far-reaching, high aspirational style of politics that tried to move us beyond our petty divisions. I was receptive to that famous speech. There's not a red America, there's not a blue America, there's the United States of America, which is still an aspirational idea, but I think to some rings hollow today. But I also was a partisan, a tribalist. I was on the blue team and I wanted to defeat the red team. I thought that the 2012 election felt existential. I wanted to protect Obama's legacy, and I was fearful for what a Romney presidency could mean for the country. I think in some ways you could say that progressives feel like maybe they cried wolf a little bit in 2012 in terms of the, somewhat vicious terms that they affixed to Mitt Romney. Someone I think is an honorable man. I then worked for the 2016 Hillary campaign. I should say that before I joined the campaign during the general election, at a time when she was already the nominee, I had previously voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. And I think that my politics in terms of my ideology aligned a lot with Bernie Sanders in terms of the focus on addressing inequality and trying to build a multiracial class coalition to make our society more fair and more prosperous for the average person.
Were
A
you
project
were you a
that's,
Bernie bro? Would that be
I hope that I was not necessarily the stereotype of a Bernie bro, but I am a man and I did support Bernie Sanders. So I
That's
can see why people might describe me as such. But the project to try to establish a multiracial coalition to make our society fairer and more equal, I think is a worthwhile project that's been attempted many times throughout history and has never quite come to fruition. But once Hillary defeated Bernie, I was all in for Hillary, particularly when it became clear that her opponent was Donald Trump, someone that I viewed as a threat, not just to my progressive politics, but to a lot of values that span across the ideology, including the importance of democratic institutions and the rule of law. It wasn't until I got involved with Braver Angels that I started to appreciate fully the value of getting out of my political bubble and started to realize that I hadn't been particularly humble over the course of my previous political career, that I had engaged in motivated reasoning where you start with an end and then develop the means in terms of the intellectual crisscrossing you do in your head. And that was through the exposure of myself to people like yourself who had different ideas and made me think about things in a new way. And I think strengthened my ability to explore ideas beyond tribal orthodoxy and face and confront the fear that that engenders in oneself. You know, what are my teammates going to think about me for thinking outside the box? And so
I feel like
I've come along.
I feel like it would be pretty arrogant of me to take credit for your humility. So, you know,
Oh yeah,
refrain.
you're not the only one, but you are the most handsome. So
Thank you, sir.
don't worry about that, John. And so yeah, I think I've come to be in a place where I see two things simultaneously: the value of humility, the value of wide coalition building, and being not just open about, but excited about challenging your own ideas, and also the recognition that today's politics is a team sport. And we essentially have two teams, the red and the blue team. There are other teams, of course, the libertarian team, the green team, and sometimes they play spoiler, but the truth is they're not necessarily impactful factors and factions the way the two main parties are. And I think the two main parties really do represent two different visions of America, not just ideologically, but also in terms of our very system of government and the limits, the things we'll do and the things we won't do. And so for me, in this midterm, the choice is clear. No surprise to our listeners, I tend to vote for Democrats. I have some issues with the Democrats, of course, but I will vote proudly Democrat. And I do hope that they are able to retain both the Senate and the House so that they can continue moving President Biden's agenda forward. That is where I come from. And I think that's where many blues come from. And again, that is not to say that I don't have issues with some of the ways in which the Democratic Party has evolved over the course of the past few years, and particularly elements of the left on the internet, I think have been alienating to people like me. And that's important to understand and reckon with. So now that we've given our listeners a bit of a window into where we each come from, why don't we dive into the midterms and some of the most contentious issues on both the policy side, the culture side, and what I guess I could call, for lack of a better term, the democracy side. Where do you want to start, John? What issue should we dive into first?
Mhm. Well, I think the economy is top of mind for a lot of Americans, and it gets difficult to choose between all of them, but we have to start somewhere. So let's go there.
All right. Well, John, what do you think the big divide is right now on the economy in terms of how the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, think about the issue of the economy? Because I think there's a lot of shared goals, but there's different approaches that the two sides embrace when it comes to strengthening the economy. How do you see the divide, and where do you fall?
Well, I think that people on the left tend to see the tend to see what we need to do as a what we need to do economically is a function of our ability to invest in different parts of America's infrastructure, both physical but also social. We need to be able to invest in green projects and programs because climate change is an issue. We need to be able to provide direct sort of aid and resources to Americans through public programs, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about social spending in the context of welfare or uh, various other investments, because equity is an issue. And particularly if you're from a marginalized group, if you're from a community of color, you're not going to be as likely to have had these sort of, intergenerational wealth and access to opportunity that's going to allow you to compete on an equal playing field with other Americans. And now, in the aftermath of the lockdowns and sort of the COVID-19 pandemic, where you've had many people who were sort of economically dislocated, direct assistance to Americans, for a lot of people on the left in particular, has become an important way of sort of making up for the greater sort of economic losses that took place during that period of time. And so it comes out to sort of a need to actively spend and invest in the American economy. And that's where you get a piece of legislation like the most recently the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, for Republicans, that way of thinking is almost a contradiction in terms. If you're spending more money, and if you're spending more money during an inflationary crisis in order to reduce inflation, you're seeking to reduce inflation by doing the very thing that sort of causes inflation, right? And so for Republicans, the thing that matters is not just that we reduce our sort of fiscal output, that we not, spend money on sort of, you could think of them as pork barrel projects, or you could think of them as very important things, but that nevertheless investments in sort of, environmental programs, in green and alternative technology, as if it's going to be something that's going to provide for our energy needs in American society, tomorrow or next week or even next year, which, it's not likely to be, certainly not to many Republicans, that these are just for many Republicans, they feel that this is largely sort of an excuse, again, to sort of expand kind of the role and largesse of government in ways that may play well to a lot of left-leaning constituencies, but that aren't going to do anything other than worsen the inflation problem, right? And ultimately are not going to create jobs and opportunities for working Americans, outside of bureaucracy and, outside of, people who benefit in a special interest kind of way from that sort of spending. And so this divide has not changed too terribly much in recent years. That part of the conversation isn't totally dissimilar from where it was when I was running for Congress in 2014. We keep going back and forth on, government spending versus reducing taxes. But that just lets us know just how enduring, these kinds of divisions are.
Well, I love that you started your answer by acknowledging the values that inform the position on the left. And I think you did a very faithful job of that. And I think that is a key part of intellectual humility. And I think you did that in a good way. And I think I, for my part, could start by, recognizing the value of some of the conservative values that inform their economic position in terms of individual agency, the power of competition, and potentially even the counterproductive effects of certain programs that are designed to lift communities up in terms of the incentives that they develop. I will say that I do believe the government has a strong role to play in pushing the economy forward by investing in opportunity. And I think it's important to differentiate between something like the American Recovery Act, which was a response to COVID and the fact that the economy collapsed and was kind of a fairly prototypical example of deficit spending, right? This was something that the Republicans did at the end of the Trump administration. They passed a big stimulus, and it's something that President Biden continued in his first term. So a lot of folks out there got two stimulus checks. They got one at the end of the Trump years and one at the beginning of the Biden years. And I definitely take the point that doing a lot of deficit spending means you risk increasing inflation because you're increasing the money supply. And so I think it's not a surprise that you saw inflation start to rise in the first year of the Biden administration. I think it's important to note that there are other factors here driving inflation, such as the supply chain crisis, such as the fact that Russia is limiting its own supply of oil and gas, which is driving inflation in Europe, which spills over to America. I think the inflation right now in Europe is actually a lot worse than in the United States. But I think it's important to differentiate between deficit spending, like the American Recovery Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which is a nonpartisan organization that essentially scores bills for how they would contribute to the deficit. And I know there's people who have problems with the CBO, and many conservatives may think that it leans liberal. That being said, based on the CBO score, the American Reduction Act would reduce deficits by $305 billion through 2031. And that's because there's stronger tax compliance included in the bill, which would improve revenue. And there's also going to be a lot of prescription drug savings. And so I get frustrated when people say, and I recognize, of course, that that might be entirely wrong. And there's certainly been lots of instances in which, a bill was developed and the CBO said it was going to cut deficits and it ended up raising deficits.
Right.
But I do sometimes get frustrated when I feel like people might conflate, a previous bill that was a stimulus bill with a different bill that includes more offsets than it does investments. And so I thought that was important to recognize, because I think sometimes the narrative can actually trump the reality when you kind of peel back the hood.
Right. Yeah. And so I do think that you're making a worthy point, which is just, point number one, that when you are in a recessionary when you're in a recessionary context, Democrats and Republicans in government are going to tend to try to counteract that by making it possible for Americans to spend more money. Now you can do that, and for more commercial activity to be taking place, so that Americans can be employed by goods and services and stay in business. And so, the two ways you do that, one is through, spending and directly sort of injecting money into the economy. And the other is, through tax reduction. allowing people to hold on to more of their money so they can do with it as they need to. But in either case, you're going to incur a price in terms of the debt and the deficit. And, I'm sure that what the CBO scoring is reflecting is the fact that if you operate under the assumption that spending is going to catalyze greater economic activity, that, over time, that's going to increase revenue, tax revenue to the government. And so part of this, as you mentioned, is also facilitating direct tax compliance. And one thing we might talk about a little bit if we have time is how that compliance kind of works, because what a lot of on the civil liberties side of the argument here, a lot of Republicans are concerned about the idea that the IRS is going to be greatly expanding its workforce. And you hear some folks, describing them as armed IRS agents. And so this kind of gets into the cultural sort of fears of, an oppressive government state and so forth. But just sticking with the economics of it for the moment, I think that one point I would probably make in response is that though you might have a circumstance in which the deficit reduces over time, the debt is still going to be piling up year after year, right? And so, and if that's kicked off by a big spending measure, yes, the deficit may sort of trickle down as the taxes, come in, but the larger problem of the debt is still an immense one. And right now we're sitting at about $31 trillion in debt. And, you pretty much just get numb to the figures at this point. But if debt matters at all, it's got to matter at levels like that, right? So, I do think that the spending concerns are still legitimate on the Republican side. Two is just that, I think the inflationary concerns have to be legitimate too, because that's just a different subject than the deficit itself. Now, I think that Democrats will make the argument, and I think probably have a good point, that in allowing Americans, in allowing Medicare, for instance, to negotiate the price of insulin or your prescription drugs or what have you, you're putting the program in a position to sort of directly lower costs to the American people in that area, right, in the area of healthcare. And I'm sure there are other similar examples, in the bill. But I think that the conservative instinct is to say that, but there's always trade-offs and unintended consequences, right? And so just through the sheer sort of volume of spending, where else are you pushing prices up by injecting, that much money into the economy? And when you talk about, expanding the IRS in order to ensure that greater tax compliance, yes, the idea is to bring in more revenue to the government, which, is meant to help offset the debt and deficit burden. But, part of what conservatives are concerned about and Republicans are concerned about is the fact that also imposes a direct cost to American businesses, that small businesses in particular and ordinary families may have a difficult time keeping up with. So in other words, if you're expanding the IRS, if you're expanding the workforce, the assumption is that you're going to be expanding audits on the American people. You're going to be expanding sort of the process of compliance that's going to require businesses to hire more attorneys, more accountants, require Americans to spend more money engaging sort of the professional tax preparation industry, which, if we had a flat tax, you could easily argue would just be, obsolete overnight, and get rid of that cost of compliance, would save a heck of a lot of money for the American people, as well as a lot of time for Americans and American families and American businesses. And so everything, I think, is a bit more complicated than the reality that's described in a simple CBO budget score. And it doesn't even mean that the CBO is wrong. It just means that, perhaps the larger impact of a piece of legislation like that is harder to predict, than those calculations might suggest.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, especially on the debt, now that the Fed has raised interest rates, because it becomes even more expensive to borrow money. On the tax compliance side, I would say that I hope the IRS focuses less on small businesses and more on the hedge fund guys who are using teams of lawyers to exploit tax loopholes that mean, as Warren Buffett has famously said, my secretary is paying a higher tax rate than I am, and there's something wrong there just on its face. So I think you and I could probably go back and forth on the economy. I will say I'm not an economist, and sometimes I feel like I'm talking a little bit out of school, but I think it's a really important divide. And I think we did flesh out some issues that Democrats and Republicans sort of naturally divide on.
Well,
Another issue.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sure, please.
Well, I was going to ask if you wanted to tackle a connected sort of sidebar here, which is sort of the subject of energy independence or dependence. And it's funny, of course, because on the one hand, that connects to the economy. On the other hand, it connects to foreign policy, because there is certainly a desire in increasingly much of democratic legislation to be able to invest in the green energy economy and Americans' capacity to participate in that economy. Because the concerns over climate change are real, and at this point, most Republicans in Congress actually share those concerns. But Republicans will also make the point that we've got a lot of oil in the United States of America that we are not actually allowed to access because of environmental concerns. But if we were able to access that oil, we would have a direct sort of pathway towards reducing the energy costs of the American people, which would reduce inflationary pressure across the board in American society, right? Because unlike some other things, or at least much more so than some other things, the price of fuel, contributes to the price of everything else, because goods have to be transported and so forth. We all have to drive everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. And that also, if we were to take full advantage of our domestic resources, we wouldn't be as dependent on the Middle East, but also on Russia, and it would make us more effective ultimately in combating despotism abroad. And obviously that ties into the conversation over Ukraine and so on and so forth. And so I'm wondering, sort of like, if you have any general sort of thoughts on the Republican kind of emphasis on energy independence, and B, if you have sort of reflections or commitment to the larger kind of environmental kind of agenda as it shows up in the Democratic Party and relates to the subject of energy.
Well, again, I would say I'm by no means an expert. My understanding is that a lot of what gives Americans sort of a homegrown advantage right now is not actually oil, but natural gas in terms of shale. And I know that the United States has massively expanded production of natural gas over the past few years, which has helped us become more independent. That's not to say that there are not big reservoirs of oil in places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which could be tapped to further expand our energy independence. And I'd certainly be interested in a conversation about the pros and cons. I think there are environmentalists who probably have some legitimate concerns about opening up such lands for oil, but I'm not really familiar with kind of the ins and outs. I will say that I was pleased to see in the Inflation Reduction Act a focus on climate provisions. For example, subsidies for folks who purchase electric cars. I think that in some ways, electric cars are going to be the vehicles of the future and obviously pump a lot less carbon into the atmosphere, which I think is contributing to climate change, which itself has massive economic costs. We're seeing more and more super climate events, which the scientific consensus tends to suggest is accelerated by climate change. We just saw a massive hurricane, and I don't think you can say any one particular hurricane or flood or climate event is related to climate change, but I think in total, there's a strong case to be made that things are getting worse. And of course, big hurricanes like Ian have enormous economic costs as well as human tolls. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to think about the issue. And I wish that folks on both sides would be open to recognizing the value of other sides' points, because oftentimes there can be very complex and contradictory dynamics where one decision has a consequence that produces the opposite outcome and vice versa. But before we get too in the weeds on the economy, and I'm glad you did bring up energy, because I think that's a really important dividing line, particularly for some Americans, I want to make sure we talk about another divide, which is particularly visceral and painful, and has become even more urgent and relevant due to the Supreme Court's recent decision in the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe v. Wade and has led overnight to many Republican-controlled states taking fairly strict action on abortion, either banning it outright or, banning it after 6 weeks, at a time when a lot of folks don't know they're pregnant. At the same time, you have a lot of Democratic states expanding access. And so when it comes to abortion, there really are two Americas. My understanding is that the majority of Americans, based on polling, when it comes to abortion and reproductive rights, are, somewhere in the middle. They don't necessarily support things like third trimester abortions. They do support some restrictions on abortion access, but they don't support strict limits that mean a woman, in order to get an abortion, essentially will need to travel to another state. Of course, there are very motivated partisans on both sides who are very absolutist, who drive the decisions often of politicians who are very attuned to base voters. One thing that really stood out to me is that Kansas put a proposed state amendment that would completely ban abortion to a public referendum. Kansas is a pretty solidly conservative state, but the proposed amendment failed pretty clearly, I think, which demonstrates that it's not necessarily a cut and dry issue. In terms of how this affects the midterms, I think Democrats see it as an advantage, because I think they believe that some of the actions taken by Republican state legislatures are unpopular. I think the Kansas decision in particular gave grist to that argument. And I think Democrats' strategy rests on trying to get those, suburban Republican voters who might lean Republican on a lot of things, but are kind of freaked out by some of what they consider extreme actions on abortion. Tell me how you see this divide.
Yeah, well, I think that it's in some sense the purest divide in all of American politics, and what I mean by that is simply that it is an issue that crystallizes our dramatically differing understanding of a very sort of baseline matter of reality, which is, at the end of the day, how do you define human life, or at least human personhood? And depending on how you define that, everything else for many people sort of starts to diverge. I mean, I'm being a bit reductionist on that, but if you believe that a human being in utero is not really a person, that's not life, or at least only life in the technical sense, then it's much more easy to sort of feel comfortable expanding sort of the liberty to terminate the fetus, let's say, particularly when there's such powerful arguments to be made and concerns to be had about the autonomy, the civil liberties, and the physical health in many cases of the mother, right? Because those arguments and those concerns are real and they are moral. I would argue. Um, but on the other hand, if you believe that life begins at conception and that therefore personhood does, or that personhood develops early on, right? Um, then you believe that abortion is killing. Abortion stops a beating heart, right? And that life, that person, is entitled to the full protections of the United States Constitution and of people of conscience, right? Wherever they may be in America. And so, from a civil liberties vantage point, I will be honest, I'm, very sort of concerned when I see things such as what you had uh, underway in the state of Texas, wherein it seems that ordinary Americans are sort of incentivized to sort of legally target abortion providers, and actions like that seem to be setting the stage for sort of the heating up of our cold sort of cultural civil war in America, and so very concerned about it. But it's not but it is also understandable to me that you would have people willing to go that far. And of course, there are cases where people go quite a bit farther in ways that are just outright tragic, right? I mean, you have had violence associated with this issue. But these moral commitments are deep. Yeah, politically speaking, I think that this is an advantage for Democrats, but it may not be enough of an advantage to allow them to keep the House of Representatives. I mean, ultimately, this represents sort of the biggest political and legal win for social conservatives in particular. And about as long as anybody can remember, it's probably worth it to many Republicans, therefore, to lose a few congressional seats in a midterm as the price of that. I think that on the level of policy, though, I just want to represent the Republican position in general, and admitting that you do have people who stand outside of this. So Lindsey Graham recently has advocated for a federal, I think, abortion ban. After, do you remember how many weeks Lindsey is? I think is it 15 weeks or something?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Right. And so, a lot of people left, but also on the right too, feel a little bit betrayed by that position because Senator Graham was somebody who was talking about how the Dobbs decision would return it to the states. But he wants to now federalize the legislation, and maybe that had been his position in times past. But most Republicans feel that this is a matter that should be left to the states. And I do have constitutional sympathy, I think, for the Republican and the conservative position, because I don't see where there's a definition of life and personhood in the Constitution. I don't see where that's in there. I do see where the Constitution says that power is not explicitly sort of reserved or enumerated for the federal government are taken to the states. That's what the 10th Amendment sort of enshrines. And on a matter that kind of is as subjective as this, it sort of makes sense, I think, on that level, for it to be an issue that the states debate on, which isn't to say that ultimately, maybe on a practical level, maybe on a scientific level, maybe on a moral level, there's, compelling arguments you can make on the other side of it as to why, this right is important. But where I really sort of feel firmly sympathetic on the conservative side is certainly on the constitutional front. Now, I'd be curious to hear what you think, because obviously, many people felt that, well, wait a second, we just overturned judicial precedent in Dobbs because Roe versus Wade was, seemed to be fairly well established, right? And there's something injudicious or sort of inconservative about overturning existing constitutional law, except that the truth is that you have a right of review with the Supreme Court for a reason, right? The Supreme Court can interpret something a certain way, but that doesn't mean that it's not up for review at a later date. You have to be sort of cautious and careful in overturning prior decisions, but that, but it doesn't mean that every court gets everything right at all times. I mean, the concept of separate versus equal stood as sort of sound constitutional interpretation in America for 100 years until it wasn't. I think that the latter decision made a lot more, Brown versus Board of Education and so forth, made a lot more made a lot more sense legally and also morally, but legally, than did Plessy versus Ferguson and the precedent that was set in the early aftermath of the Civil War, enshrining the idea that you could legally differentiate between Black people and white people and still call that equality and honoring the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. And so, I I want to do some justice to the Republican, the conservative position there anyway. And curious to know, if you have if you have kind of a reaction to the legal back and forth, or any aspect of this debate and divide here.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, must caveat by saying I'm no legal scholar. I think I'm sympathetic to some of the legal arguments put forth by conservatives that Roe v. Wade did not necessarily pass constitutional muster if you look purely at the text of the Constitution. There is no quote unquote right to privacy that is explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. I believe it was one of the justices who relied on the quote penumbras and emanations of the Constitution to develop that right. And
Correct.
I can see how, from a legal perspective, that could be a relatively frail basis. At the same time, I don't always think that a purely textualist approach is the right way to interpret the Constitution. Interracial marriage, for example, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the right to marry someone of a different race is protected. I'm not necessarily comparing that to abortion on substantive grounds, because I think on substantive grounds, there is the right of a fetus. There is another entity involved. But that being said, a lot of our fundamental protections when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to same-sex marriage, again, the Constitution says nothing about marriage, come from an interpretation of the 14th Amendment. What does liberty mean? And so I think that there is a robust constitutional debate to be had. I'm curious, what do you buy? Do you buy the argument that the majority of Americans are somewhere in the middle, where they're uncomfortable with abortion, especially in later term of pregnancy, but they're also uncomfortable with very strict restrictions that would either explicitly or essentially outlaw and criminalize abortion?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And if you were a member of Congress, which I know you tried to become, and I wouldn't be surprised if you one day try again and perhaps even succeed.
Oh, Lord.
How would you vote on something like a national 15-week abortion ban?
Oh, wow. You're really putting me on the spot. Well, I mean, yeah, I think that this is, personally, I would not vote for that. I think I do think it is an issue best left to the states from a constitutional vantage point. But I do want to say this, though, and, by the way, I echo all of your caveats about not being an expert in particular on any of these subjects, and really that's got to be a central point in the purposes of this conversation, because what we're seeking to do here is to be transparent, I think, about our opinions, about our biases, about what we maybe think we know, right? On the basis of what we've studied. But you and I have both been in politics, on either side of the aisle, and now sort of on the same side, and Braver Angels side here, which is all sides, right? a good number of years. We've interacted with many people who are experts, who are scholars and academics, as well as politicians and journalists and ordinary Americans who work in healthcare and in government and all sorts of places. We have the benefit of having many different sources of information, and yet I think you and I both know that we don't know enough to speak as confidently about some of these things as maybe we're sometimes tempted to, and as our political pundit class always does, you know. But part of where I have a great deal of humility on this issue is whatever I think about the constitutional merits of it, you know, I do not know, and I would like to think that this is in keeping with the truly conservative temperament, but I'm a little bit reluctant to sort of, you know, want to advocate for sort of very strict policies around abortion regulation, at least from the vantage point of, I don't know what all the unintended consequences of that may be. I've had really hard conversations with my wife about this subject because, you know, I do bias in terms of being sympathetic to the pro-life, you know, argument legally, but also, you know, sort of on a moral level. I mean, I'll admit to that. I'm one of those Americans who feels uncomfortable with abortion, to be sure. And I have a personal history with abortion, and I've written about that for Braver Angels and USA Today and so forth. You know, but I don't know, for instance, you know, if you draw sort of a time-bound limit on when a person can have an abortion, or if you try to regulate sort of the procedures by which a person has an abortion, if that doesn't put women in jeopardy of having certain negative health outcomes because they're being swept up in a broad policy, when really a doctor on an individual basis needs to look at a person's circumstances and say that, well, you know what, you know, in my judgment, this procedure, which has been made more difficult to access by this policy, is actually necessary, or at least very helpful in preserving, you know, this woman's health. Or, you know, strictly speaking, you know, this time you know, limit may mean that I cannot, you know, conduct this procedure, but there's at least a fairly significant chance that some bad health outcomes could sort of develop within a certain window of time, and I can't perform it because of this policy. People who know far more than I will go down a long list of sort of real and hypothetical sort of situations in which sort of a blanket policy has an unintended consequence, even if people in principle are making exceptions for the life and health of the mother. I'm not really in a position to give the best articulation to what those points are, but that's precisely why I do feel, you know, humble about the issue, because I know there are people out there with greater expertise than I have who are making those arguments, right? And at the end of the day, I'm also not a person whose body is going to be regulated, sort of in this context, you know. And so, you know, for each of the issues we've talked about, I think that we can go down a list of things, and maybe we should, that we don't know. You know, I don't know, you know, every sort of program that, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act is sort of going to be in investing in. I don't know where there's going to be benefits that I'm not necessarily aware of. I don't know, you know, the ins and outs of climate change and the science behind it. I feel like I have some strong fundamental understanding of economic principles and the way in which prices sort of, you know, raise. And I know that the pain that Americans are feeling because of inflation is real. What are the environmental trade-offs, though, and how will that ultimately impact us if we sort of commit to domestic drilling? I don't entirely know. I can give voice to my thoughts. But this is why I need, you know, you, Ciaran O'Connor, and the people who we engage in discussion with to fill out what I don't know. And if I'm so wedded to my partisan opinions that I can't hear those other points, you know, then I wind up being sort of the type of personality that generates the culture of politics that we have pervasively in American society as a result of the way the pundits and the politicians on the highest levels of American society are content to talk about and debate these issues. with big mouths and closed ears. And, so that's not how I want to be. And so this is the balance that I think we're trying to show.
I think it's very well said, and not just closed ears, but closed hearts. And I think it's important to embrace humility, not just on the level of rationality and expertise and empiricism, although that's critical, but also on the level of experience. There's so much I don't know about policy when it comes to the economy, but there's also so many experiences that have been experienced intimately by all sorts of Americans with which I'm unfamiliar. And those experiences are important. And if you don't recognize that, humility is much harder to achieve.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to keep both in mind. I know we're running short on time, so just tell me if you need to end this podcast. But there's a couple more issues that maybe we can squeeze in. The first is immigration. And the second is what I might refer to as the meta narrative about American democracy, who gets a voice, and what politicians are permissioned to do in the pursuit of power. So, starting with immigration, how do you think about immigration as a conservative, also as someone who lives in a city with a huge population of immigrants, being close, I imagine, to many people who come from immigrant families, and the conservative position in an environment where immigration has become so politicized and immigrants themselves have been treated as political pawns?
Right. Yeah, so I grew up in and still live in Los Angeles, California. And I was raised with a very sort of explicit admiration of Latino culture. And, of course, we take Latinos as a unified group, which they're not really, I think. But if we take Latinos as a unified group, they're, overwhelmingly sort of the largest source of our immigrant population. And my father was deep into boxing, and was best friends with folks like Bobby Chacon, who was two-time lightweight champion of the world, Chicano, Mondo Ramos, who's also two-time, I think, lightweight champion back in the 60s or whatnot. And I used to be an amateur boxer when I was a kid, and my dad would make boxing themed bumper stickers celebrating names like Pepino Cuevas and Carlos Palomino and Roberto Duran and Alexis Arguello and all these folks. And that kind of became an entryway into conversations with folks who we would meet in different parts of LA, older, usually Mexican folks, but not always. And Dad would talk to him about, seeing the great fighters, El Gran Campeón de Mexico, like my dad with a little bit of Spanish would try and go into these conversations, and would sort of bond with older Mexican folks who had, memories of those great fight days and so forth. And I grew up with, a lot of kids who were Mexican from other parts of Latin America. And also in education, have worked at a part of my life in sort of expanding tutoring and academic opportunities for low-income Latino kids in particular. And I've gotten to sit down with their families. And these are most often families where, parents, or at least the grandparents, maybe speak very little English, and are people who cross the border in many cases illegally or without documentation. The language is polarized, right? So I'll just say it both ways and, be criticized for both sidesing it. There's a great deal of humanity in that experience, which also requires humility of me. I will say, though, that, the conservative kind of impulse here, and I think many liberals actually share it, is to believe that borders matter, that the rule of law matters, right? I do think that there are consequences to sort of an unending stream of immigration, and that those consequences, while there's, benefits, I think, to being able to import a workforce that can contribute to different industries and so forth. But you're also importing competition for working class Americans economically. You're importing pressure on actual physical communities that have to absorb that influx. You're importing a potentially sort of a cultural kind of balkanization, because you'll have communities form where the community is still sort of wholly a transplanting of the country and the culture where they came from, and not necessarily assimilating into the culture around it. Now, I kind of loved that as a kid growing up in Los Angeles. I was very sort of comfortable going into sort of like all Latino areas, and you can find, you can go to Chinatown, you can go to different places, and you're from New York, so you understand how this shakes out. And to me, that's kind of a beautiful thing. But I do also understand the issue, the tension, where suddenly, it's very difficult to build cultural bridges from one group to the other, because we are literally speaking different languages, right? And sort of encasing that in ways that are sort of inaccessible to outsiders. From a policy vantage point, I have tended to believe that border security really matters. I don't know if we need to build a wall. That always felt a little symbolic to me, and perhaps in a negative way, because it became so synonymous with nativism. I would argue because of the way President Trump introduced that. At the same time, if a reinforced physical barrier, and we do have some, fencing and so forth on the border, and Trump contributed to that, but some of that was already there, I believe. But if that worked, practically speaking, I would be very much okay with that. And so I think that this is where many Republicans and conservatives are coming from. And of course, a huge part of that has to be also recognized as the inevitable fear and sensitivity we have to the idea that we are also importing crime, and that we are also importing drugs. Now, this part of the conversation becomes very sensitive and delicate, because, you will sometimes hear folks on the right, some folks, in my opinion, fairly thoughtlessly, sort of framing the issue as if, like immigrants in general are just more, from Latin America, are just more predisposed to be criminal than other people. And I think that the data shows that that is not true. It is not my understanding that people crossing the border, even if illegally, are otherwise more sort of predisposed towards, crime and so forth once they're in the country. At the same time, though, one, you do have a drug, trade that pours across that border, which is killing people, in America and around the world. And so in a recent Republican primary debate, I heard J.D. Vance make the point that, with Ohioans, people in the state of Ohio, J.D. Vance being the author of Hillbilly Elegy and a candidate for United States Senate in the state of Ohio, it made the point that, with the number of people in Ohio dying of fentanyl, that Ohio essentially shares a border with Mexico with respect to this problem, right? It's because many Americans will argue that, well, hey, you're not even a border state, and most of the Republicans don't even live along the border. So what reason do you have to be concerned about illegal immigration if it's not your jobs, being threatened and so forth, other than racism? And that's an answer to that question, right? So Americans have reasons for being concerned about, the problem of illegal immigration that doesn't, just reduce itself to mere prejudice and bigotry. I would count myself as one of those Americans who has that manner of concern.
Yeah, that was a really nuanced and comprehensive stream of thoughts, and I think that I identify with what you said in a lot of cases. I do think sometimes Democrats who live in cities like New York are not necessarily sensitive to the concerns of border communities. And keep in mind, a lot of these border communities are actually quite Latino. If you look at the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and I think that the notion of border security the fact that we do and should have borders is one that is widely supported on both the right and the left. Although I will say there are people on the left who proudly say, I don't think we should have borders at all. And I don't believe in nationalism. And I think that's inhumane. And I do think it's always important to try to keep in mind the humanity of immigrants themselves coming over the border from Mexico, many of whom are trying to escape very violent and very harmful conditions, not just in Mexico, but in Central America.
Right.
But I take the point that I think, a lot of Democrats can be almost cavalier and say, yeah, sure, border security, but they're not necessarily thinking about what that also means for people who live in those communities. I think part of the problem is that the federal government is enforcing the laws that are on the books. And the laws that are on the books right now have a lot of problems when it comes to how immigrants are processed. I know that immigration courts are overwhelmed. There's a system of asylum seeking that means that immigrants can come into the United States, request asylum, and their court date might not take place for months and years. And by then they've gone into America and started working, and they might not necessarily want to show up to their court date. Although I do think that compliance is relatively high, but of course there are plenty of immigrants who claim asylum and then try to disappear into the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is a real policy problem that needs to be fixed, but it's been impossible to achieve any sort of bipartisan consensus. I think the last time you had a promising attempt at immigration reform was one led by John McCain and Marco Rubio, but was essentially ultimately squashed by other Republicans who felt that it was an untenable concession to the left. And so we're left with the system we have now. And from a political standpoint, where I think the issue of abortion favors Democrats, I think the issue of immigration tends to favor Republicans, because they can point to the situation at the border and they can point to something that feels real for people, just as gas prices feel real. And I personally am hopeful that falling gas prices will be a boon to Democrats, but the greater the gas price, the harder it is to make a complicated, wonky argument about the causes of inflation when people feel that every day. And I think people feel immigration in a similar way.
There's
before.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just and I think that those are all very worthy points. I would just say that one other real cause for humility on this subject has to do with the larger history that kind of lies behind us, as ethnic groups and people on this continent. And I'm just mindful of the fact that when we talk about Americans' concerns for border security, the rule of law, and particularly many Republicans have this sense that our country is being sort of invaded by folks that coming for all the right reasons in terms of wanting to take care of their families, but who still are sort of coming here in violation of our sort of the will and intent of American law and therefore the American people. And I think people will hear that and oftentimes sort of think to themselves or say out loud that that's really rich, coming from a nation of folks, particularly when we're talking about, at least very many white Americans whose ancestors took this land by force from indigenous people. And that then, the United States of America as a younger nation then sort of took, land in the western, portion of the country in Southwest, away from, the country of Mexico by force of arms. And that therefore there's no real kind of moral kind of like credibility to that indignation, coming from many of us Americans. And I want to be sort of humble in the face of that, and in all directions, because I do think that that is inevitably a source of intercultural animosity that is passed down generation after generation. You know, um, from people who may be of indigenous descent, and more likely just simply sympathize with and feel a great deal of sort of guilt over that history, as well as for people who are in many cases Latino immigrants, the children of immigrants and so forth, who feel that this land that we sit on was taken from their ancestors anyway. And I've certainly had conversations that focus in on that. And so there's reason for humility from a person like me in that direction. But I would also hope that people would consider the fact that when we talk about Americans in 2020, we're talking about people who are not their ancestors, who didn't do the things that their ancestors did. That doesn't mean that there's not a larger conversation to be had about how we relate to our history and what the moral implications of that history are for how we engage the present and the people who we find ourselves sharing a country and sharing a continent with and sharing space with in the present. But I just want to make the point that that's a very deep conversation, and it's not merely reducible to the policy disagreements. And so, we haven't really had the opportunity here to get too deep into some of the cultural pieces of this, but every policy piece kind of, whether directly or indirectly, winds up tying in to the culture wars that are really kind of like, the wellspring of our deep divisions here. And so it's worth being humble, I think, in the face of that reality.
I completely agree. And I think one of the reasons the divide on immigration is so visceral is that it really does touch on the notion of American identity.
Yeah.
Who claims American identity? What is an American citizen? And who gets to tell the story? So before we go, and I should note that we're not just in 2020, we're in 2022.
I'm sorry.
We should talk about...
We're always stuck in 2020 now. It's the year that never ended.
I know. It's like a time warp. You hear Democrats often say that this election is not just about disagreements on policy or ideology, but it's a battle for the soul of America. And it's a battle to preserve our democracy. And they point to events like January 6th. They point to efforts by the former president, Donald Trump, to try to overturn the election and pressure Mike Pence to refuse to certify the election. And they also point to extreme rhetoric they've heard on the far right. And they say that they are the ones standing as a bulwark to the descent of America into some kind of proto-fascist nation. I'm trying to represent what you hear on MSNBC and on Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to some of this when it comes to actions by high-level actors within the Trump orbit, because I think it's hard to deny that President Trump took certain actions. But I think it's also important to be humble and recognize that painting with a broad brush is unfair. And I think that people on the left have become increasingly comfortable with ascribing the actions of certain political actors to anyone who identifies as a Republican. And I think that that's really toxic. If you get to a place where you say the other side is fascist, it permissions dehumanization and demonization, and if not the embrace of, the excuse of political violence. So I think we're at a really dangerous time for our country. And I think it's really important for people to be clear about what they see as threats to democracy, but also be precise and try to resist the urge to stereotype and flatten and demonize. So I guess that's a bit of a mealy mouth answer, but I do think this is top of mind for a lot of people in terms of motivating their vote. They're not just thinking about ideology and policy, they're thinking about our very system of government. What do you think about this divide and dynamic?
Well, I have a somewhat similar criticism of Republicans, particularly in the context of the sort of broad sort of political class and pundit classes on the right's response to Joe Biden's what I consider, himself to be sort of, delivering of overly and kind of willfully divisive rhetoric, this sort of, castigating of, MAGA Republicans and kind of describing them in terms, not very far removed, I think, from what you've just sort of laid out as being kind of the default take on MSNBC and so forth. But what Republicans have been saying is that this is Joe Biden, labeling all Republicans in this way, that everybody, is in league with the anti-democratic forces of Donald Trump, and that therefore these folks should be, socially sanctioned and excoriated. Joe Biden, however, has, I think, very consistently sort of differentiated between MAGA Republicans and mainstream Republicans, the Republicans he says that he has worked with to pass bipartisan legislation that really, in point of fact, represent a majority of rank and file members of the Republican Party, a party which, in Joe Biden's view, has sadly become hijacked by an extremist faction within it. And it's that extremist faction that he is trying to sort of politically and socially isolate, right? And so I think that there's been, from my vantage point, a fair amount of sort of intellectual dishonesty on the Republican side in terms of leading voices kind of trying to characterize the president's intent differently. But even having said that, I still see things about the way that you do. I mean, I think that, this is the way we play the game in politics in America. I happen to share, well, on this issue, it's tough. I mean, I myself share a lot of the deep concerns about some of the claims made with respect to the 2020 election having been stolen through voter fraud that allow me to be sort of, very sympathetic with a lot of folks on the left, a lot of, sort of never Trump Republicans, and others who feel that what you have is, in my opinion, not speaking for, anybody beyond myself, because, here at Braver Angels, we've had conversations with our own members and leaders who do feel that the 2020 election was stolen. And I think it's been important for us to have those conversations. Even as a Republican, I don't quite share that view. Yet, on the other hand, I do find myself very concerned about things such as the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook. I do think there are reasons to be concerned about ballot harvesting. I think that there are sort of a wide range of areas for improvement in the electoral system, and that, more broadly speaking, as Wilfred Riley argued on this podcast, even if the election was not stolen by fraud, I think you can look at the way in which it's sort of covered by sort of mainstream media outlets, the way in which the social media platforms have sort of inserted themselves into the conversation, potentially even the way perhaps sort of, Google might engage with search results. There is at least the sense and suspicion on the right, which I can feel like I can very much see where it comes from and may even resonate with me a bit myself, which says that the major institutions of mainstream American society do sort of actively seek to kind of prejudice the political outcome of our races. That is a different subject from voter fraud in terms of like ballots being fraudulently, cast or duplicated or, Dominion voting machines being somehow influenced by satellites or actors in Italy and foreign countries and so forth. But I do think that there's a larger kind of like sort of sense that kind of like the system sort of being rigged a bit, which gives me, which I have space for feeling sympathetic towards with respect to, the feelings of my fellow Republicans and conservatives. And so, this larger issue is not going away, neither for, Republicans who feel that the election was stolen through fraud, and also not for people of color and activists on the left who feel that the electoral policies of Republicans nationally, of state Republicans in places like Georgia and elsewhere, are tilted deliberately towards making it harder for, people of color in particular to be able to get out and vote. And from a vantage point of humility, with respect to both sides of this argument, including that side, I feel like there's a lot I still have to learn about what these arguments are grounded in. I know some things, I've got concern when I hear that polling places are being closed in places like the state of Georgia that are servicing very concentrated African American communities. I don't necessarily leap to the conclusion that is a necessarily sort of racist motivation behind that, but crass politics might suggest that if you've got a concentrated community of Democrats and you're a Republican, you don't necessarily want it to be as easy for them to vote. Democrats do tend to seek to sort of make it easier to cast ballots. Republicans do seek, generally speaking, to hew to sort of a stricter kind of protocol. There are both practical and moral justifications for each of those impulses. You want to expand the franchise, but you also want to make sure that the process has integrity. There should be sort of a balanced and constructive sort of dialogue to take place across those two impulses, right? But the question is are people sort of abusing or manipulating or exploiting the system in either of those directions for reasons that are not, conducive to, not about serving the common good and the health of democracy, but rather the narrower interests of one political party or the other. And so, it is important to try and represent the sides fairly. And we've got to be humble even in terms of our ability to do that, because I don't think you or I, as much as we try, can do that 100%. And yet, every effort in that direction is valuable. Hence the value of this conversation today.
Yes, and it is only through these sorts of humble and trustful conversations that we can explore these shared values when it comes to expanding the franchise and also ensuring that voting is safe and secure, while also at the same time advocating for the politicians we believe will represent the right to vote. And I should note that Braver Angels is explicitly focused on hosting conversations around this issue. We hosted a workshop in Boston a couple months ago where we gathered progressives primarily concerned with voter suppression and conservatives primarily concerned with voter integrity is the phrase that they use. And we had a really constructive, productive conversation that produced a list of agreed upon desired outcomes. And we plan to expand this workshop across the country in the lead up to the midterms and beyond. As I mentioned, we're going to be inviting Americans across the nation to participate in this conversation about the midterms, starting with a public debate on October 20th that I encourage everyone to join. I also encourage people to send us feedback on this podcast to media@braverangels.org. And before we go, I want to leave everyone with a little bit of a tease, a little bit of a treat, a little bit of a dessert. John, you've got a new podcast cooking. What can people expect around the bend?
There you go. And I've embarked upon solo podcast ventures before, but this one is going to be a handsome production. So it's Uniting America with John Wood Jr. On brand, on the nose, ladies and gentlemen. Straightforward conversations, interviews with some of America's leading public intellectuals, elected officials, journalists, pundits, etc., where I will be challenging folks to see the humanity in the arguments and the experience of the people with whom they disagree. And while also providing a window into the on-the-ground work of Braver Angels online and in communities, where you can see our programs making an impact in the democratic life of folks all across this country. And so that you can look to mid-November to see the launch of. You're going to be very, I think, excited about some of the guests that we have on in the early going. And if you want to hear more of me and my ramblings, it'll be a good way to do that as well. So, yeah, check it out. Uniting America with John Wood Jr. Coming to a computer screen or a cell phone near you.
Well, I think we can all be excited for that. And the Braver Angels podcast will keep rolling. John, I know you're busy, but you'll keep stopping by here and there. And I just want to thank you for participating in this conversation. I thought we covered a lot of terrain. We got deep on a couple issues, and I will humbly say that I think we did a good job modeling humility, although please tell us if you think we didn't. With that, I thank John. I thank you for those listeners who've made it this far. This was a long one, and we'll see you next time.